Get on up.
Everybody right there.
Get into it.
Everybody right there.
Get involved.
Everybody just come on up.
Good, thanks for being here. Mame, we're going to start with you and hear about a really fascinating project that you are working on this summer involving abandoned housing here in Buffalo, and in particular the risk of fires at abandoned housing. So tell us a little bit about what you were working on this summer.
Yeah, so this summer I'm working with the Western New York Law Center, and I'm looking at the relationship between vacant and abandoned properties and residential fires, specifically for the year of 2016. And so for that, I went through a third party because the process to get information from the city just takes a lot of time. I don't really have that with an 8-week fellowship. So I found a police scanner called Erie County Firewire, and they were able to give me audio files on all the fires, police calls to fire departments in the city of Buffalo. And then from there I looked up all the addresses, collected all my information, and so I had 192 properties that were called in for fire in 2016. And I went through and found 10 data points, so things like tax delinquency, if it appeared in the interim, if so, what year.
So you were trying to find out, of these 192 calls for the fire department in the city of Buffalo in 2016, how many might involve a property that was vacant or abandoned?
Yeah, because right now Buffalo doesn't really have a registry or any way to keep track of the vacancies in the city, and so unlike similar cities like Syracuse, Buffalo doesn't have that, and so there's no real way to track vacancies. So part of my fellowship is actually helping to create a policy proposal to the city, or at least recommendation that would try to bring them to want to create a vacant and abandoned property registry to kind of push homeowners in the way of either making their properties occupied or selling them to people that would want to occupy them.
Because we do have a problem in this city of people sitting on vacant and abandoned properties, owners, maybe out-of-town owners a lot of times, who are holding on to them because they think the property values are going to rise and they'll be able to flip them, and in the meantime they're not taking care of them and they cause a great risk for fire. So of those, what was it, 162 or so? 100? How many calls to the fire department were you looking at?
192.
192 residential properties where there were calls to the fire department. So far, how many does it look like of those 192 probably involved a vacant or abandoned property?
Right now I found 23 23% of the homes had multiple indications of vacancy. So I think that is around 44 homes.
And is that, so about 44 out of 192. So a lot of our fires here in the city of Buffalo involve vacant and abandoned properties. So that explains why you're so interested in this, that this is a real threat to our health and well-being here in the city, to have all these fires coming from abandoned properties. Looking at other cities around the country, is that a high number, a high percentage of fires to be coming from vacant and abandoned?
Percentage-wise, yes. If you look at FEMA's report, I think from 2015, it was looking at the years 2010 to 2012, I believe. Their report showed that about 7% of fires nationally were in vacant or abandoned properties. So we're looking at 23% for Buffalo. That's significantly higher, about 3 times higher than the national rate. As far as number of fires, again, because it's a third party, I don't have exact numbers on properties that were affected by where the fire started, and so I only have where the fire was started or at least reported from.
Right.
So assuming that, say, it spread to one other home or something like that, it's around average for other cities. I looked at Norfolk, Virginia, which is around the same population density, and they had, I think, 360 something fires for the year. So it's probably around the same number for Buffalo, but they didn't tell me which number were vacant.
Right. So it might not be that we have an unusual number of fires in Buffalo, but it seems like we probably have an unusual number that concern vacant and abandoned properties. And so the policy aspect of that you were starting to tell us about is that you're going to be suggesting that the city actually create a registry of vacant and abandoned properties. And then in addition just to knowing more about them, what would some of the consequences of having that registry be? Yeah,
so the Law Center is looking at Syracuse's example specifically, and so with Syracuse they have a 4-year plan. So the first year you pay a fee, and then each year it goes up to, I think, about $1,000 per property. And so you pay every year to register your property. That way the city knows which homes are vacant, and then you create like a plan with your city. That way they know how you plan to get the home up to code and or put the home for sale or renovate it and things like that. And so what it does is it incentivizes homeowners to either get their properties occupied or sell them to people that want to occupy them. That way you're not bringing down the rest of the community, because with vacant properties, a lot of times, like with foreclosed properties as well, I think I read a report that said every year you have like a property that sits vacant, it costs like the community $52,000 per property, and then that even extends after the property is sold. And so every year you leave your property vacant or you let it deteriorate, it's not a cost to just yourself, it's a cost to your entire community.
Right. I think anyone who lives near a vacant or abandoned house knows that it drags down your property values, it decreases your quality of life, it becomes a magnet for crime and illegal activities as well as for fires, as your report is demonstrating. Well, fantastic. Thanks for the great work, Mame. You're listening to The Public Good here on WUFO AM 1080. Our guests today are 3 Cornell University High Road Fellows who've been here for the summer working on projects involving things like abandoned housing, affordable housing, inclusionary zoning, anti-gentrification, community benefit agreements, and the like. Our next guest today, Joe Anderson. Joe's been working with Open Buffalo on issues of gentrification and anti-displacement. And you've got a big event coming up. You're going to be back in school, but you're helping plan for it. Tell us about the summit that's coming up.
Yeah, so on September 2nd from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., it's going to be an anti-gentrification summit, which is going to bring together a lot of organizations across the city who are doing work around, things that can have that gentrification lens. So homelessness, education, affordable housing, so anything that could have that anti-gentrification lens applied to it. There's going to be a summit in which these organizations can present to the group through breakout sessions, can educate other members, and it's essentially going to be a call for actions for the city of Buffalo to really commit to anti-gentrification efforts and building a toolbox of what those anti-gentrification efforts look like.
So people have really been alerted. I know we issued a report this spring about why Buffalo needs inclusionary zoning and talked about the fact that rents have been going up quite sharply in the city and in the region, even as poverty and concentrated poverty have been getting worse, not better. So people are really caught in the squeeze, and we do have an affordable housing crisis in this city, even though we're not like San Francisco or Boston or places where the housing market is, really out of control. So what have you learned about some strategies that Buffalo might be able to use that will help blunt the effects of this problem?
So obviously the best solution would be a very strong inclusionary zoning policy that would be accessible for everyone to really understand. And so when you write an inclusionary zoning policy, it's essentially saying when a developer builds residential area, residential development, a certain percentage needs to be affordable housing for low to moderate income people. And so one of the percentage that was really being pushed for the inclusionary zoning policy was 30%. And right now it kind of got stalled out in the Buffalo Common Council. There's a vast array of opinions from each council member what they believe is the correct amount of percentage on inclusionary zoning. And then on top of that, you add that when developers build, sometimes that inclusionary zoning could be tax benefits, that when you build that affordable housing, you have that tax benefits. So there are facets of an inclusionary zoning policy, and there are vast array of opinions among the council members.
Seems like where we're at the council is that at this point, most council members have said they are in favor of drafting a new inclusionary zoning law, but there's a lot of back and forth about what that law will consist of, and a lot of discussion with Mayor Brown's administration, and of course the developers are weighing in very heavily and are a little less excited about the possibility of the new law than some other folks. So that's one tool in the toolbox. You've also been active helping the land trust that started up in the Fruit Belt neighborhood, the first land trust in the city of Buffalo, FB Community Land Trust, Inc. Tell us a little bit about that. What is a community land trust, and what's going on in the Fruit Belt?
So essentially a community land trust looks to acquire land in a neighborhood, and then on that land build that affordable housing. And so the community land trust itself will own the land, but it won't own what's on top of the land. Whoever builds on that land, that's who will own it. So it helps many people accumulate wealth, which is a necessity, because then it helps people, start moving this uptrend. So then eventually you'll have the land trust, what would hope to be owning several plots of land connected to each other, creating a community with affordable housing, and so that really aids in the anti-gentrification spread. And you saw land trusts do very, very well, especially in the city of Boston, in which a couple of the members from the Fruit Belt and members of the FB Community Land Trust Board of Directors went out to Boston and saw the Dudley Street Community Land Trust, and that worked very well. It kind of stopped a lot of gentrification in that area, and also helps bring the community to advocate for itself again. And so at Dudley Street, they got a very large community center, just like Darius Pridgeon has proposed to the Fruit Belt of giving them a community center and helping build that community center in their neighborhood as well.
So a land trust can include affordable housing, but it can also include space for commercial development, for nonprofit development. But the key is that the community owns the land and it gets to control what happens there rather than outside developers calling all the shots. So really exciting that there is a land trust in Buffalo now, and now the campaign, of course, is to get the city to donate some of the vacant lots that it owns in the Fruit Belt, and it owns over 200 in that neighborhood alone, to the land trust rather than simply selling them to the highest bidder. So that campaign is still fully active, and that anti-gentrification summit that goes on in September will be another chance to learn about tools like inclusionary zoning and community land trusts that Buffalo can use to confront this growing problem of affordable housing in the city. Thank you, Joe. We'll turn to our third High Road Fellow for the summer, and there are 22 of you here this summer, 23? 22. 22 of you. Michelle Zhao is one of them. She's been working right here at PPG, learning about community benefit agreements, among other things, including the first community benefit work that really happened in Buffalo, which concerned the development down at Canal Side and resulted in the Erie Canal Harbor Development Corporation adopting a set of high road principles and promising to abide by those as it develops Canal Side. So, Michelle, you've been researching some of the history of how that came about. Give us that history in a nutshell. How did we end up with the Harbor Corporation adopting this set of what we call high road development principles?
Right. So in the development of Canal Side, what the community was really looking for was a voice of their own in deciding what the future of Buffalo's waterfront would be. So in the decisions surrounding that, the Canal Side Community Alliance, which was organized by the Coalition for Economic Justice, and also PPG's involvement was a great part of that, spoke to people on the side of ESD, Empire State Development, and the Erie Canal Harbor Development Corporation, and said there are certain economic development principles that are in this idea of community benefits agreements that we would like to see implemented in the construction and development of Buffalo's waterfront. And so that history involved a lot of meetings, negotiations, and in 2013 an agreement was decided on that we are now looking at to see years later, 4 summers later, whether or not those principles were actually implemented.
So when we talk about high road economic development, and you guys are high road fellows, so it's something close to your hearts, I know. What sorts of things are we talking about when we talk about community benefits or high road economic development? What are some of the provisions that you might see in agreements like that or principles like that?
So the main provisions include living wage, paying a wage that makes it so you can a living wage, basically. My bad.
More than a minimum wage.
More than a minimum wage, something that's sustainable for your economic growth in the community. The hiring of local businesses and the incorporation of local businesses, not just ones out of the state, so that you can centralize economic development back to the city and strengthen the community around you. The use of minority and women-owned businesses. Also, the incorporation of environmental standards. So, for example, in the High Road Principles Agreement in 2013, LEED certification was one of the provisions that was emphasized. And so even in discussions in an interview that I had with someone on the ESD side, the development and the construction of Explore More Children's Museum, which is going to be completed in the next year, they're looking to make it so that the building is LEED Silver certified, not just LEED certified, because if it's silver, then the provisions are a lot stricter, and then they actually have an environmental benefit to the society rather than kind of just like a loose label of being environmentally sustainable.
So that's an example of one of the provisions that got negotiated with the Canal Harbor Development Corporation was that buildings should be green and sustainable, and it's good to hear that they're planning that the Explore More building would be LEED certified, which is a high standard for green buildings. You had a chance to sit in on an Open Buffalo High Road Economic Development Coalition meeting with Empire State Development's Sam Hoyt. Did he make any commitments at that meeting regarding these community benefits?
He did. He said within the next 4 weeks there would be a progress report released by ECHDC on whether or not these 2013 principles have been carried through in the development over the course of the last 4 years. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Many community benefits agreements around the country are legally binding. We tried for that here in Buffalo with the waterfront. We didn't get that. We didn't get a legally binding contract. What resulted instead was Erie Canal Harbor Development Corporation agreeing to adopt this set of principles. Their board voted on it. They formally adopted them. But now it's time to see, to what extent they're being carried out, and it's great to hear that they'll be reporting out on that to the community. Michelle, you also did a lot of work on what we call our Buffalo Briefs at Partnership for the Public Good, a set of briefs that folks can find on our website that give basic information about Buffalo employment, population, poverty, education, environment, topics like that. Just be curious to know what some of the data that you saw that most struck you about Buffalo was.
I think the most recent PBG report release was working towards equality, looking at racial disparities and transportation within the city of Buffalo. And what struck me was that in the city of Buffalo, in order to really reach the full potential of your employment opportunities, transportation is essential. So having a car cuts your transportation time and your ability to find a job by so much. And so when I was looking at that, it was striking to me that the NFTA wasn't doing more or expanding lines into new neighborhoods that reach low-income families so that they can elevate their economic status within the city of Buffalo.
Yeah, we reported in that report that 58% of the jobs in the Buffalo metro area are not accessible by public transit, and unfortunately the NFTA has been cutting routes, not adding them. And that, of course, has to do with funding. So the big call in the report was for more state funding for the NFTA because the NFTA can't expand routes without money to do so. And the most important source of their money is state government. So there is a very active campaign from our friends at Be True, the Buffalo Transit Riders Union, and Coalition for Economic Justice and other partners to seek more state funding for public transit so that we can improve on that number and make more of our region's jobs accessible to public transit. Because if you don't have a car, and over 50,000 people in this region do not have a car, that means you're shut off from more than half the jobs in the region. And it means that those employers lose access to all those potential workers. Great. Well, you are listening to The Public Good here on WUFO. Our guests today are 3 Cornell University High Road Fellows. They've been spending the summer in Buffalo working with our nonprofit partners at PPG. They've learned a lot about Buffalo, and I want to turn to them now and ask them for some reflections. 2 are from out of town. 1 grew up in Buffalo. It's always interesting to hear what people have learned about Buffalo, what, from an outsider's perspective, you feel are some of our greatest assets, but also some of our greatest challenges here. So we'll start with you, Mame. What really struck you about Buffalo this summer and your experience here?
Yeah, from what I knew about Buffalo, it wasn't a lot until I took the class that goes along with the fellowship. But even from that, I think coming in, I had a lot of expectations of, I know Buffalo's struggling, and about the 60 years of population decline. You expect to walk in and see an area that isn't bustling, that isn't vibrant, that doesn't have a lot going for it. But when I came to Buffalo, I saw the exact opposite. We went, I think the second or third week was the Allentown Arts Festival. We went to Canal Side, seeing even just downtown how it's been growing, and even my office is being renovated, things like that. So it wasn't what I expected as far as what a city on decline should look like, and then being here at the same time, I see all these beautiful things and how everything is going so well in certain areas. But then the few times that I am in a car that I can drive through areas in Buffalo where I'm not just on the metro, it's a totally different story.
Right.
Like with my work, I have to go visit 10% of the homes to look at them just so I can get an idea of what I'm looking at. And driving, I think, the 500 block of Fillmore, it felt like a different town. You know? But at the same time, like, just looking at the parts that are doing well, like, gives me hope in what I will see, hopefully, in the coming years, especially after Governor Cuomo dedicated the $10 million to the east side of Buffalo.
Right.
So I think I was surprised in how well Buffalo is doing, but I'm excited to see what other things that can happen.
Yeah, and I think all of the three of your work has to do with this great question of how do we leverage some of the growth that is happening so that it actually benefits people living in the neighborhoods and not just people who live downtown or along Elmwood, or people who are commuting in from the suburbs and enjoying things like Canal Side. Now, Joe, you grew up outside the city. You spent the summer inside the city and working with Open Buffalo on issues like affordable housing. What were some of your biggest learnings about Buffalo this summer?
So for me especially, I really haven't experienced the city growing up in a suburb of Buffalo. I lived in Williamsville for my middle school and high school years here, and it was an immersive learning experience essentially. You take public transportation every day. You start to realize that, you can't advocate for these issues unless you really live these issues every day. And so that's why, I saw different things. When you grow up in the suburbs, the only place in the city you really go to is Canal Side. But, living in the city, I have, gone out to the Fruit Belt. I have seen that these are very, very important issues that people need to start advocating for if we want, all of the city to be lifted up and not just certain sections of the city to be lifted up. And so that's why I think, people doing the work in Buffalo really need to experience it as much as possible. And so living in the city this summer has definitely been, fantastic and eye-opening.
Excellent. Michelle grew up in Long Island, spent her first time in Buffalo this summer. What were some of your surprises or things that called out to you or really interested you about Buffalo?
So what surprised me being a New Yorker from downstate was that I used to refer to all of upstate New York as upstate, but Buffalo is distinctly western New York and also the second biggest city in the whole state, which I didn't know. And there's a degree of vibrancy in Buffalo that was just totally unexpected to me, and you can see that in the sheer number of refugees that Buffalo receives every year. And in working on the PPG briefs, the number of languages in the Buffalo public schools really struck me, because not only are there over 80 languages in BPS, those languages are languages that I've never really seen or been around, coming from Long Island and coming from a place that's near New York City, like languages from Burma, from Bhutan, from Syria, like all these different countries and cultures that just that are quite unique to Buffalo, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you were talking about the number of languages spoken in the schools going up from, what was it, like 40 to over 80 or something like that?
Right, in the last 10 years.
So really rapid fire change with just this proliferation of different refugee communities settling in Buffalo from all over the world. Many, many different languages and cultures, not just one or two, but 80 some. So those are some of the exciting kind of dynamic things in Buffalo. What struck any of you or all of you as our biggest challenges? So if there's one thing we need to really focus on and change here in Buffalo, I'd be curious, maybe start with you, Mame. From an outsider's perspective, now kind of an insider, you spent the summer here. What's the one thing we need to work on here in Buffalo?
I think housing, affordable housing. I work in my office. I'm with mostly interns in the office, and so a lot of UB students and recent grads. And I think the big issue with them has been there are a lot of properties like apartments you can get for under $1,000, and then there are a lot of properties you can get for $3,000 plus. But where's that middle ground, And so there are a lot of people that are kind of in that in between, and I feel like there's this huge untapped market, and a lot of things being renovated right now, but they're not being renovated in that mid-range, for housing. And so, at least from my perspective, I think kind of figuring out how to accommodate for those people is something that should be on Buffalo's radar, and I don't know if it is.
All right, great answer. Well, we are running out of time. I want to thank our three High Road Fellows who've been on the program with us today, Michelle Zhao, Joe Anderson, and Mame Breacham. Great job this summer. Great to have you with us. Hope that you will come back to Buffalo, even if you're not from here like Joe, and spend more time with us. Next week on The Public Good, we'll be talking with more of our Cornell High Road Fellows, hearing about their experiences in Buffalo. It's The Public Good every Tuesday at 1 p.m. here on WUFO AM 1080.
Everybody over there.
Get on up.
Everybody right there.
Get into it.
Everybody right there.
Get involved.
Everybody just